Hey there everyone. Today I wanted to address a question that I got on a video, maybe more of a quip, that I think is really pertinent to the kind of content that I cover on this channel, and I think it might be helpful for those who are having some trouble understanding or reading or making it through the dense web and forest that is some of these very difficult, quote-unquote, unintelligible works. Responding to my recitation of the final monologue of Finnegan's Wake, Fabricio Rodriguez says, "Gavin, I finished some unintelligible books and found the experience profoundly displeasant. Could you explain me the joy of reading texts like those? For example, in philosophy, I finished Deleuze's Difference and Repetition, but it was a total dismay for me when I looked at the work I've put into it and what the book gave me back in terms of content and experience. I've tried some other experimental works as well, but I was always left with this feeling of, well, there's someone else who's done it better and clearer. Why did I put so much work into it?" Finnegan's Wake I'd never read, by the way. Should I? And I think this is a very relevant question. And this initial kind of response will be a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but in terms of it being profoundly displeasant, good. I think we tend to take for granted the way we use our brains. We tend to operate on autopilot most of our lives, thinking that pleasantry is the name of the game. That, for example, if a conversation caused strife, if it caused confusion, ambiguity, stress, or discomfort, that it is therefore bad. But I think oftentimes, and you'll know this even if you've lived a modicum of years, that the greatest intellectual experiences are the ones that leave one profoundly discomforted, confused, offended, dismayed, confused, all of these emotions. So in part, I think that it is important that we consider reading not just as a pastime, but as an exercise of its own. One that takes strain. And this commenter, Fabricio, certainly seems to be in such a situation. He's put in a lot of work, and he's thinking about the return on investment that's going on. And that's a totally fair point, because Deleuze's Difference and Repetition is indeed a very, very challenging work. It's probably one of the most challenging works of philosophy I've read, if not the most challenging work of philosophy I've ever read. And I think it's partly because the kinds of questions that these works are asking are so central to our experience, but so peripheral to the sorts of questions and conversations we tend to have, that the terms upon which such an argument could be had, on which such a conversation could be had, are not readily available already. We have concepts and words that exist that we use every day, like, for example, manly, what it means to be manly. There is a whole panoply of associations that go behind this concept that we take for granted most of the time, and we assume that most of our concepts, if they're not immediately providing us with some discomfort, they're therefore fairly fixed. We think that what it means to be manly is fairly clear, but in fact, a lot of gender theorists, for example, show that it's not so easy. Hi, Sancho. As a result, these thinkers have to come up with new ways of using old language to address old problems newly. They have to find a way to creatively unearth the assumptions in our terms that already exist and show the gaps. And that's exactly what Deleuze is trying to do. This is, for all intents and purposes, a very standard work of ontology. It is concerning being. And it is concerning the relation of these two terms, difference and repetition, to being. And in particular, Deleuze wants to decenter the work that has been done on ontology away from that of questions of identity and towards questions of degrees of difference and repetition. He wants to shift ontology away from essences and towards dynamic processes that occur to varying degrees. And that might sound simple, that might sound very complex, but he does it in a lot of different ways. About half of the book is just very kind of critically assessing what has gone on in philosophy in terms of ontology thus far and the way they have approached their problems, and then Deleuze kind of departs from them and shows how radically different his project is. And the question of radical difference is what can make such unintelligible works so unintelligible. They are addressing problems in a way that may seem so foreign that the questions don't need to be asked yet. And they may do so using words in a way that is so different from the way we use them now that the differences don't really track with us. A great work when I think of this is Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. There are a lot of terminological distinctions in this work that aren't fixed in the original German, first off. They're made no easier. My friend Dr. Rolf Goebel has told me how profoundly unreadable this is, even in the German. For example, the difference between the for itself, the in itself, and the in and for itself. Also the difference between notion and concept. These have profound differences in this work, but they don't in our everyday language. And because of that, it's often easy to look over these terms and see them as synonyms, when in fact they are oftentimes antonyms, or in profoundly different domains, such that if we fail to understand the degree of complexity that is brought to these analyses, then we will basically overread, in the sense of reading over, of passing over the most important things of the argument. As such, I don't mean to imply that Fabrizio, for example, merely isn't putting in the work. I have no doubt that Fabrizio is putting in all the work necessary to understand these books. And as such, there are a number of responses. First off, the book just may not be for you. It may not be problems that you find relevant, and therefore the sort of aha moment that you're supposed to get from the work may never come to you. I still remember specifically the paragraph that I got that in. It's paragraph 346. I even have it starred, especially so that I will remember it. I remember getting this aha moment, where it ends, "The consciousness of the infinite judgment that remains at the level of picture thinking behaves as urination." Which you're like, what? What does that even mean? Come on, Hegel. And in part, he's trying to do that. He's trying to use some poetic language here, talking about the baseness versus the transcendence of certain acts, and he equates the baseness with urination, and it's kind of funny. I've done a lecture going into detail on that paragraph for such reasons, but these thinkers are also so profoundly disrupting our ways of thinking and doing, because thinking is in fact a way of doing. It is a way of acting in the world, and it requires a number of tools, most of which have already been given to us. We don't think twice about them. These thinkers try to profoundly disrupt that. They try to deconstruct. Think about Derrida's kind of discipline of deconstruction, where we're trying to profoundly flip the hierarchical binaries that are in place in order to show the arbitrary nature of those hierarchies, and therefore displace the various conversations that we have based on those binaries. And a lot of these works are doing a very similar thing. For example, Finnegan's Wake. There are so many things that Finnegan's Wake is challenging. It's challenging the nature of character. Is each character individual or inherently multiple? Narrative. Is narrative told in one voice, or is every voice split such that narrative is necessarily multiple? Form. Is form linear, or is form in fact rhizomatic or circular, hearkening backwards and forwards in such a way that really destroys the notion of linear time? And there are tons of other things that this is challenging. I mean, the difference between transcendence and immanence in a very similar way to Deleuze, hence my fascination with the work. But these are doing things that don't already have terms upon which to make these kinds of arguments. Therefore, in Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, for example, another of these unintelligible works, so to speak, she's talking about phallogocentrism. She's talking about discourse. She's talking about gender fluidity. She's talking about terms which, especially when she was writing this, were kind of on the cutting edge. And she's writing this within such a specific academic discourse that if kind of an everyday reader, if I gave this to like, I don't know, a random college friend or my mom, they probably would not enjoy it because it requires so much background knowledge. And that's what a lot of these unintelligible works beg, is a tremendous amount of background knowledge. Because, right, I mentioned that they're using terms and languages and questions and phenomena that already exist, just doing them in a new way. So you might need a lot of stuff in order to rearrange those elements, in order to build something new. It's like trying to build a tower. And if you need to build a new one, it might be nice to have a bunch of rubble over here so that you can make even just a tiny tower that's more structurally sound, for example. So a lot of these works are going to profoundly challenge the idea of ease of reading, of the rapidity of payoff. A lot of these kind of grow on you over time. The arguments sort of connect to a work over here, and they beg that you read that work, and then, oh, that argument will make sense. She's talking about Claude Lévi-Strauss. She's talking about Jacques Lacan. She's talking about Jacques Derrida. She's talking about Michel Foucault. A lot of these theorists have their own oeuvres to unearth and to read, and when you do that, you come back to this and you say, oh, okay, now I understand the real force of her argument. So going back to Fabrizio's cited difference in repetition, this is talking about Plato and Aristotle. This is talking about Leibniz and Spinoza. This is talking about Nietzsche. It's talking about lots of contemporary thinkers as well in the philosophy of mathematics, talking about Riemann spaces and stuff like that, non-Euclidean geometry. Lots of background information is needed. And one of the reasons this is so challenging is because a lot of philosophers don't have a lot of math knowledge. Me included. There was a lot of looking up what the heck is a Riemann space in order to understand a lot of the arguments that are going on here. So in terms of the payoff, not only is the payoff not always immediate, but you may not have the background knowledge not necessary to appreciate the work. And that's no shade. Most of the works that I read, I probably don't have enough background knowledge for. But I make my way through them, and I just kind of diligently try to take count of the specific terms that they're using, the relative weight that they give to each of those terms, the syntax, the style, the function of various terms and the way that they relate to each other. All of this needs to be taken in extreme detail. Because, for example, Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, when I tried to read it for the first time, I took maybe 3 to 5 tries of getting stuck around page 15. And I would just put it down and I'd be like, I just cannot get this. And I finally had a breakthrough moment where I just said, okay, you know what? I'm just going to truck on. And I trucked on, and some of this past stuff started to make a little bit more sense. And I said, oh, okay, so sometimes I just need to jump in the deep end. Now, how do you know if you're going to jump in the deep end and learn how to swim versus jump into the deep end and drown and die? Well, you don't. That's why literature and reading literature is profoundly experimental in nature. And thus these unintelligible works are themselves experimental in nature. Experimenting with, like I said, narrative, character, form, style, semantics, etc. So a lot of this might not be very helpful. It might lead you saying, okay, so what do I do if I read Difference in Repetition and I just didn't like it? Well, I think sometimes, and I've had this happen with certain works, I can't really think of one off the top of my head, that I've read and said, you know what? Actually, I do. The Ethics of Ambiguity by Simone de Beauvoir. That work was just bad. And I know it's bad, not because I was confused by it, but because I can say exactly why it was bad. I can put into terms that she's given me. I can say, Beauvoir, based on the terms that you've given me, your argument sucks. It's incoherent. It's purposefully ambiguous in order to evade its own lacklusterness. You know, that's where we can start getting into the kind of semantics of how do we know when someone is really making a bad argument versus being ambiguous with a point. Because oftentimes the ambiguity of these passages has its own point. For example, here's just a random passage. He says, we define energy in terms of the difference buried in this pure intensity, and it is the formula difference of intensity which bears the tautology, but this time the beautiful and profound tautology of the different. Energy in general will not then be confused with the uniform energy at rest, which would render any transformation impossible. Only a particular form of empirical energy, qualified in extensity, can be at rest. One in which the difference in intensity is already cancelled because it is drawn outside itself and distributed among the elements of the system. So this is in part using very kind of hypotactic, very specific language, very cutting and syllogistic, but also it's slightly poetic in the way that he's talking about it. This beautiful and profound tautology of the different. I mean, he's obviously kind of inflating his terms a little bit to make it sound nice. He continues later, on the other hand, there is an intensive space with no other qualification, and within this space a pure energy. The transcendental principle does not govern any domain, but gives the domain to be governed to a given empirical principle. It accounts for the subjection of a domain to a principle. The domain is created by difference of intensity and given by this difference to an empirical principle, according to which and in which the difference itself is cancelled. Wow, right? That's some really dense stuff. And you might be like, literally, what is he saying? And part of the thing that you'll realize when you read these unintelligible works is a property of writing that Derrida mentioned, called citational grafting. This is the capacity for any piece of writing of any kind to be taken out of its context and put in a new context. And this tells us a lot of things about the nature of language. First off, it is not constrained by context, in the sense of it cannot function outside of its original context. As we just saw, I took those words out of its original context. I didn't cite it in context. I didn't read you the whole book up to that point. I didn't even read to you the whole paragraph up to that point. I started in the middle of a paragraph. And yet, the words still made sense to you. You could still tell these words are different words. This is a sentence. This is a phrase. I'm hearing things that I understand to be words and not just random gobbledygook, even if the words don't kind of come together to form a nice semantic whole. Right? That sort of identification shows that citational grafting is a key part of every piece of writing, and that has to be reined in a very particular way in these works. Because, for example, Deleuze is making some very complex arguments that weave together across the entirety of the work, such that it is not linear, but it is rhizomatic. It points to various parts, all of which are useful nodes that hearken to other nodes, and they sort of branch out in ways that cut across the novel. It's not a novel, it's a book, but it reads like a novel sometimes. But right, this is the sort of stuff that makes it where if you want to understand these works, you have to be so conscientious of context that if you try to just open the book to a random page like you might do at a bookstore to kind of get a feel for something, you will be totally perplexed because you haven't let them work out their terms for you. And Deleuze actually does a fairly good job of explaining his terms in here, much more so than in Anti-Oedipus or A Thousand Plateaus or What is Philosophy. The terms are very clearly laid out here. It's very kind of syllogistic and analytic. But to get back to Fabrizio's comment, what if someone has just done it better? And this is just the harder way to the same conclusion. Well, I want to challenge you. First off, that may be a possibility. I don't want to discount that at all. For example, a lot of the stuff that Hegel writes in here, I have seen argued clearer. Hegel's not a good writer. I'm sorry. He's very dense, very circuitous in the way that he does a lot of his argumentation, and therefore it's very long, often very boring, often could be said simpler, better. And again, in the German, it's still like that. But nevertheless, I want to challenge you that perhaps there is something to be had in the work of being confused, of being dumbfounded, of being completely hoodwinked by a work to the point where you feel tricked, where you feel like they're trying to kind of pull your leg. Richard Rorty has a concept, a type of thinker that he calls the ironist. And the way that he talks about the ironist, an ironist is using the current terms to show how they've already been pulling our legs, how they already pretend to be more than they are. And the ironist comes in to poke at the bear, to make the bear roar, such that we see that the bear is in fact crying and yelping too. That the bear is doing all sorts of other things that we haven't been thinking about. That the bear is hungry too, just as we are hungry. I'm kind of, going off on a limb here. But the point is that when we look at these kinds of works, perhaps the circuity is nice sometimes. Perhaps there does need to be this kind of depth to address the depth of this problem. I feel very strongly that especially the work that Deleuze is doing here is very timeless. It is still very central to a lot of the philosophical problems we're facing with, for example, trans issues. I think that this work is very relevant to discussing trans issues, to the philosophy of language, to hermeneutics, to literary criticism, to a number of other things, concerning gender identity and whatnot. And I think that we need to give literature the credence that, first off, sometimes it is showing instead of telling. We are used to treating authors like an authority figure, where they tell us what they want on their own terms, and we understand those terms. But, as Wolfgang Isa has put it, reading is pictorial in nature. It gives us images, it gives us impressions in a way that sets a scene, and oftentimes these scenes have been set in ways which are different from the way we've ever seen these elements be used. And in that way, it's our job to be conscientious of the new ways that things are being used and give it the credence that maybe there's something to be had there, that maybe there is some usefulness for taking the long road, that maybe, think about what goes on when you work out. You break your muscles down and then they accommodate and they regrow anew, stronger than they have before. We know that this is how the brain works. The brain responds to this kind of work, and it will adapt and it will learn how to tackle problems in newer and newer ways. So at the end of the day, maybe you think Deleuze's Difference and Repetition is just a bad book. That is your right as a reader. I disagree. But that's your right as a reader. And that will always be your right. And I think that as long as we take seriously the idea that reading should be work, that it should be uncomfortable, often painful, perhaps nauseating, confusing, terrifying, alluring, seductive, sexy, all of these things and more. If we accept that perhaps literature can be this, we may realize that unintelligibility has its own joy. That's why I love Finnegan's Wake so much. That's why I say, Fabrizio, maybe you should try reading Finnegan's Wake. Maybe you'll like it, maybe you won't. I really have no way to say it. And neither will these authors. That's one of the points, is that the authors know that this is kind of out of the ordinary, the way that they're speaking. This is not the way general people speak. They're highly academic, highly heady and intellectual. And that's why literature doesn't appeal to everyone. And no value judgment about that. It's just a factual statement that some people won't like Finnegan's Wake because they don't care about questions of fatherhood or of the cyclicality of history or portmanteau words. It's not interesting whatsoever. That's totally cool. And maybe that's the case about this unintelligible work you're reading. But maybe there's something that can be found in that midden heap of confusion. And I challenge you to ride this line, to be smart about it, and to say that maybe a work is genuinely unintelligible and it is just bad. For example, Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, I think that is not entirely a terrible opposition to this text. I don't think it's unintelligible. You can tell by my annotations that certainly I got something out of it, or I wouldn't put all this money into putting sticky notes and stuff in it. But part of the unintelligibility is genuinely a fault of the author and can be placed on the author. And I think we shouldn't be too quick to do that. We should first look inward and say, what is the author trying to tell me about me, my terms, my culture, my society, the historical moment I'm in? And then we should also say, what does this say about the inadequacies of the author? What does this tell me about the goals or the missions or the biases of the author? And these are all open-ended questions that I can't answer for you. So that being said, I hope that this has added something to this question of unintelligible literature, of whether or not it's worth your time to even entertain them. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which I do the second Sunday of every month. You can get help with any reading you may need, any questions or concerns you may have. You can also just look at my email, my channel description, if you just want to send me an email, because I'm always open. I also have super thanks if you just like to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap, but care for yourself first. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.